My name is Itoro Nehemiah. I'm going to skip some of the other introduction, but you can reach out to me at my email address and social media handles are there in case you have questions that are not answered during this session. All right, so first question is, or usually when I have a topic, what I would like to start with is the why, right? And it usually provides context for almost every other conversation around that topic. So the first question I had in mind when I got this topic was, why do we write end of year reports? Yes, I've changed the create to write because more often than not, the end of year reports are written. So we are writing end of year reports. And it's a question that we need to answer, and in answering that, we will provide context for the rest of the conversation. So I basically took the term write end of year reports, right, and broke it down. But we're going to read from, or break it down from right to left as opposed to left to right. So the first question is, what's the report? A report is basically a communication of findings for one reason or the other. You could have reports that are oral. So you go on a field trip, you come back, and then you give your supervisor an oral report. Or you could have a written report in the form of a memo, in the form of a pitch deck. But the whole idea behind the report is to communicate information, to communicate findings for one reason or the other. Right. So why at the end of the year? Why so much focus on the end of your year report or the annual reports or statements that companies typically put out? And it's because the end of the year sort of gives you or allows you to have perspective and insights and findings, or report perspectives, insights and findings over the period of the year. So you can look back on the year, as I'm sure we also do in our personal lives. Towards the end of the year, you have that time for personal reflection. You look at things that you set out to do at the beginning of the year and how far you've gone, and how much more you have to go. And this will also help you in goal setting for the next year, right? So the whole point of the end of the year is because a year is a fixed time that sort of gives us, or is a measurable time that gives us perspective over a year. There's certain companies and there's certain scenarios in which you give, say, monthly reports or weekly reports or even quarterly reports. So for example, the companies listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, especially the banks, are mandated to put out quarterly reports, like reports of how the last quarter has been, in addition to their annual statements. But basically, reports are usually time-based, and the duration of a year is often a good time to look back, reflect, and draw out insights and findings. And then why do we write? Why don't we, say, put it in a voice note and send it to your supervisor who can listen to the voice note? I mean, some people think it's easier. I'm biased, or I have a different opinion, but that's not why we're here. But why do we write? We write because writing aids the thinking, it aids information flow. When you write, you're better able to structure the information as opposed to when you are talking. I don't know how many of us who have friends that can shalai, and from state to tomorrow, and they'll just keep going round and round and round and round. Typically, with writing, it will be harder to do that because you have to sit, think, and construct your sentences and think through the flow of information. So, writing end of year reports enables us to communicate findings and insights over the period of a year in a coherent and cohesive manner that is easy to digest. So, what are the common use cases of end of year reports? We find, as I mentioned earlier, we use them as to measure progress, right? So we use the end of year report provides context as to what we set out to do versus what we eventually did. And there's something that Peter Drucker, one of the fathers of management consulting, says: you can't improve what you don't measure, right? So a report enables you to actually measure and take stock, right? An end of year report could also double as marketing material. And as I'm sure we may have come across at some point in newspapers or even social media posts where different companies are posting things about maybe their financial performance or their growth or their impact if non-profit. Those reports, or the end of year report, is where most of that information is sourced and then used as marketing. Now, it's one of the things that investors would typically look out for in considering companies. They look at their performance over time, and one of the easy ways for them to find that would be on marketing material or pitch decks posts that they put out. At the same time, your end of year reports provides a basis for your next year projection or your strategy formulation or tweaking. So there's something that we say which I believe is general practice, is that you don't project from budget to budget. So if you're preparing your financial budget for the next year, you don't project from budget to budget. You project from what you did this year to what you hope to do next year. You go from where you are, and any of your reports helps you to put concisely into words and charts, graphs, images. Basically helps you to document concisely where you are today so you can chart a path forward. So this evening, we're going to be having the conversation on end of year reports across 4 sections. And we're going to look at setting the tone for the reports, the who's and the what's. We're going to take a look at numbers and where they sit, what use they are. And then we're going to look beyond numbers to the art of storytelling. The fourth bit, which is information design, is something I'm going to run through very quickly. It may be a lot of information, but hey, just bear with me, and you will always have the videos to go back and read through. And I believe that at some point there will perhaps be a session dedicated to information design because it's a practice in and of itself. All right, so let's get started with setting the tone. We're basically looking at the who's and what's of end of year reports. We looked at the whys, and let's look at the who's and the what's. Now, there are 4 pillars of report writing that I have outlined here, right? And the very first one is content is king. As we defined report writing, or why we write reports, is because we're trying to communicate certain insights or findings. So those insights, those findings, that content is king. That is the crux of the matter. That is the cake, right? So everything else we do, everything around structuring, everything else around making it look nice, making it look fancy, is the icing on the cake. The cake itself is the content, is the findings, which is what you're trying to communicate. So in writing reports, I would often say start with the content, right? And you may not necessarily start with the content on the canvas that or in final document that you're going to put together. You could start with the content on Excel, you could start with the content on Microsoft Word, but it's just basically a place where you dump all these findings, all these insights that you're trying to communicate before you then begin to structure, right? The second bit is know your audience. Now, there's a different way one would write a report if it's for internal use, and there's another way you would write a report if it's going outside. If it's for internal use, for example, there are certain nuances that you may not need to fully explain because the stakeholders are in the company and would know. So maybe if someone got fired, or if half of the team decided we're going to Japan, you may state that without giving so much detail because the person that is reading the report already has a backdrop of information as to what's happened. But if the report is going outside, for example, you may need to explain everything, especially if you don't have evidence, right? So know your reader and know what's important to them. There are certain, and I think this is nowadays beginning to become most bosses or most supervisors that do not necessarily have the time to go through the entire 9 yards. You just want to look at, give me this, give me this, give me that, and I'm fine. I want to know what my revenue numbers look like. I want to know how many projects we delivered on. I want to know how many of this. There are certain things that are more important to certain supervisors, to certain companies, to certain industries that you would need to pay attention to. And we'll talk about how one of the ways around pulling out this particular information as to what your audience may be interested in further down the line. Right, so third thing, if content is king, structure is queen, right? Because you may be trying to say 10 things, but the way you order it could make it very, 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 very confusing. So imagine someone walks into the room now and just goes, "Oh, I'm coming. The bread is not here yet, but I am going to get it later." Context. It's haphazard. You may be thinking from where to where, right? The structure of how information is presented and how it flows is important. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it. So imagine the person then, rather than giving you those 3 sentences haphazardly, the person goes, "I am trying to get breakfast for XYZ," and then goes, "The bread is not here yet. Yes, I like bread. That's why bread came up. I'm going to get it. I'm coming." It makes more sense, right? Because of how it was structured. So if content is king, structure is queen. And then finally, keep it simple. Most of the time with these reports and nowadays, we find that people have dwindling attention spans, right? So less is often more. Keep it concise. Leave the fluff out of it. Except you work in an industry where your work is quantified by the volume of your reports. I know this happens sometimes in government-related agencies, right? Where they want to see, the thick, the thick books and all, which more often than not people don't read. Except in those sort of situations, and even in those sort of situations, I would say keep it simple, and I'll explain how one can manage that. Right. So these are the 4 pillars. Content is king. You need to first know and be sure of what it is that you're trying to communicate, the findings and insights. Dump them somewhere. Know your audience. Once you've dumped those things in one place, know your audience. You can then start, filtering. Certain things are more important than others, right? So all fingers are equal, but some are more equal than others. You have all your content somewhere, you have your findings somewhere, but you know that to the audience you are writing this report for, certain things are more important. You can then start filtering and make it concise, or make it more concise. Then once you have the content you're then looking to communicate, next thing is structure. Structure is queen. How you arrange it is important. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it. And then finally, keep it simple. Keep the English concise. Keep it simple. Avoid verbose. Avoid technical speak on, except it's industry terms that your reader would be able to understand. One of the things you find in some end of the year reports that you have is that you have what referred to as a glossary of terms. And this is because they understand that some of the persons that will pick up that report to read it may not necessarily be industry experts, so they'll need all those terms explained. Right, so now let's look at what the typical content, right? Since content is king, let's take a look at the typical content or sections we find in reports, end of year reports. So you'd have, more often than not, you have the executive summary, which basically provides a highlight of the entire report. It's useful for persons who don't have time executives who don't have time to go through the entire thing. You just want to get what the meat is and run with that. It's usually 1 to 3 pages. More often than not, we're advised to keep it to 2 pages max as executive summary of everything in the document. Just keep it to highlights, keep it to the key things that are necessary in the report. Now, depending on the volume of the entire report, you may skip this section. So if the entire report is 10 pages, there may not be a need to have a 1 or 2 pager that summarizes the entire thing. If your report is, say, 5 to 10 pages, you may not need that. But if your report is above 10 pages, or say we're looking at 20, 25, 30, 50 to 100, it would be great to have an executive summary that basically gives you the idea in brief, such that someone can pick up that document, read that, and get the gist and move on. Right? Then you have an analysis of the business environment. Now, this is something that is very helpful for context setting, and this is where structure comes in. Now, it's almost like if a company tells you, I did 150 billion in revenues this year. I may not be able to tell if that is great or if that is not great in isolation. I mean, as a layman and looking at my bank account, of course, 150 billion is great, right? It's great. I would agree. But in the context of their operating environment, how much did their competitors make? What percentage of the market share did they have? What was the growth on that 150 billion? What did they do last year? And if they grew by 2% and their competitors grew by 10%, then the 150 billion doesn't look that great anymore, right? So the first thing up that typically comes is to set the context of the operations of the company. So basically, you portray the business landscape looking macroeconomic indices and perhaps industry-specific measures. So things around, maybe GDP, population, and then you could maybe have personal analysis. So if, for example, the business was a business that was cash-heavy, and earlier this year, we had the whole cash crunch that happened, it would be good to provide that context that, hey, this happened, and this affected our business in this way or that way, right? And it would then give context to some of the other reports that you would give with respect to how the business actually did, right? So first thing that usually comes is the business landscape. Let's look at macroeconomic. How's the economy doing? How's the industry doing generally? It provides context for the company's performance, or the department's performance, or the product line's performance. And it also provides a benchmark for comparison, so we can get meaning out of the report. Then we jump into the operations overview, or the operations report itself, which is the crux. which is where the findings as to what the company did that year basically is detailed, or is put out in detail. Now here we were talking about what was done by who, where was it done, how was it done, what were the goals to begin with, what was the outcome, did we meet it, what percentage did we, what were the KPIs, how did we measure all of that. All of that falls into the operations report, right? And the operations report is often contextualized by whatever goal was set for the year, right? So you would put just the same way we put the business operations within the context of the operating environment or the business environment, we're going to put the business performance within the context of what we set out to do at the beginning of the year. Right. Now, the flow and structure in this particular section is what is really key, because this is the meat of the report. So the flow, document flow, structure, and we'll talk about that further down the line. Then finally, you then have your impact report or your impact overview. Now, this usually takes the form of a financial report for profit organizations, and then it will take the form of an impact report for non-profit organizations. So basically, after all is said and done, after all the running around we did this year, after all the projects, what were the end results? How does this impact our core reason for existing as a business? Now, typically you'd have financial reports, and then you have impact reports. Then you could also have other metrics along ESGs, environmental, social, and governance goals. Now, the other sections in a report, typically you'd have the appendix, where you throw in maybe detailed tables of stuff you put as charts, your references, if you referenced any industry information, glossary of terms, market outlook sometimes comes in if the end of year report also doubles as a strategy document for next year. All right, so now with structuring tips, I'm going to quickly run through this, but first things first, typically is to throw out the list, map out the segments when it comes to your operations reports. So think about it, your company may have departments, your company may have geographies, your company may have different product lines, or your company may have had different projects over different timelines. Basically map out the segments, or adopt a categorization system, and then list out everything that happened. And in certain cases, depending on how the report is going to be structured or the nature of the company, you may pick one or more of these categorizations. So missing means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, and it's just a way to think around categorization that helps for structuring communication and documents and ensuring that there is a cohesive flow. Right now, so for each section or each segment that you've then mapped out and you've listed a couple of things that happen, you kind of need to have a core idea for each of those segments. So for example, the marketing department, what's the core idea? Did we do well? Right? Or am I trying to say that the marketing department performed above average? Is that the reason for this segment? Or if there's perhaps an operations segment, am I trying to say that the operations segment did very well or grew very well? You need to have that core idea. And that core idea is typically what will form your storyboards. That's something that's typically at the top of your slide that basically summarizes everything in the slide, right? Or gives the point of that slide, right? So it basically states the conclusion of the argument. So and then you back it up with proof. So the proof is what stays in the bottom or in the other half of the slide. Where if, for example, I'm saying that my operations department did great, I can say the headline could be the operations department performed or grew tremendously, performing or grew by 50% and outperformed other departments. And then that's my storyboard. And then in the content, I can then start giving things around what was their production volume last year, what was their production volume this year, what was production volume of other departments, what was production volume of other industries. So basically that bottom section basically proves or brings proof and evidence to the conclusion, which is the storyboard. Then finally would be to engineer the flow. So as you move from section to segment, segment to segment, to section to section, you kind of need to engineer the flow from one point to the other to ensure that it locks and connects. Typically, the idea is to have a top-down approach. And you see that even in the structuring of the content that we have, or that is typically in reports, we also took that top-down approach. So first of all, we have the executive summary that basically summarizes everything. We said that before we look at the operations reports, operations overview, we take a look at the business environment, which is the bigger circle. Then we come down to zoom in on the company. What did they do? How did they do it? Then we come down to further zoom in on what was the impact of everything that was done. Right. So top-down approach is what is encouraged. Now, when you're moving from segment to segment, it's important to keep in mind certain interrelations between departments or between segments and interdependencies, so that you can put the section that you can put dependent sections after the sections that they are dependent on. So there's a smooth flow. So I don't get to one point and I'm wondering, okay, what do you mean by this? Because I don't have context of the interdependency. Right. So moving on to the second section, numbers don't lie. And we're going to be looking at discussing the metrics that matter. So there's a saying by Edward Deming: in God we trust, everybody else should bring data, right? And data is I mean, they say it's the new oil nowadays, right? Now there are key metrics we look at, and I'm just going to run through them. And again, this is a top-down approach in the flow of how the content of reports typically go, right? So you have key metrics on the business environment, so things around GDP, inflation, disposable income, FX rate. Now they're usually macroeconomic indices. There are a number of them, there are a ton of them. Not all of them would be useful for or will be relevant to your industry, so it would be good to, streamline, right? And just pick the stuff that is necessary. If the product you're selling or the project you've undertaken do not require some of those metrics, there is no need to include them. But what these metrics basically do is that they give you an idea of the business environment, an overview of the business environment that the company has been operating in. Then we have standard metrics that almost every company has, so numbers around their financial performance, impact numbers, year-on-year growth rates, and the like. Those are standard things that almost you find across most companies across different industries. Then you have industry-specific metrics. So these are metrics of measurement or performance metrics that are specific to your industry. Just like in the banking sector, for example, you may find metrics like net interest margin. In the retail segment, you may find metrics like inventory turnover, sales per square meter, that sort of thing, right? Or spread, gross profit margin is general. But, I mean, you find this kind of metrics. So there are industry-specific metrics that would also be there, and then there are company metrics, company-specific metrics, some things that may be specific to the project that you set out to do and the KPIs that have been listed at the beginning of the year. Now, if you're not sure of what metrics are relevant for your organization or what metrics are relevant for your industry, Google is your friend. Two things: you could just do a simple search of performance metrics for fashion industry, performance metrics for retail, or you could also take a look at the reports of your competitors. Who else in your space has put out a report maybe last year? What did it look like? What sort of metrics were they looking at? And if you can find any Nigerian reports, I'm sure you'll find a ton outside the country. Now, there's sort of different types of data. There's nominal data, which is basically what did you do? I think in previous example I used, so revenue is, I did 150 billion in revenue. That's nominal data. It's an absolute figure. It is what it is. It's just as they appear. And this nominal data form the basis of everything, right? So it's key to have these first, and then analysis begins to happen. The other two are a product of analysis. So ratios and comparative data are a product of analysis. So ratios of multiple items to one another. So for example, gross profit margins, efficiency ratios, retention rates, cost to income ratios, percentage market shares. These are basically just looking at these nominal data as a ratio of something else within the same period. Often two dissimilar items. So two dissimilar items. Then you have comparative data that basically takes you to things like growth rates or decline rates, or what percentage you use to outperform the market, what percentage you use to underperform the market, that sort of thing. Now, with comparative data, you have comparison of similar data, similar data maybe across different periods or across different categories. So for example, last year I did 120 billion in revenue, January to December. This year I did 150. By the time I'm comparing that to bring out growth rates, that's comparative data, right? Now, typically where data is concerned, I would advise that we use Microsoft Excel to aggregate your data first, so that you can carry out all this analysis, pull out all the figures, get all the insights, so that by the time you are getting to the storytelling side of things, you already know what kind of stories you want to craft, right? And then we're now going to look at the storytelling side of things. That's looking beyond the numbers, right, to the art of storytelling. Now, I'll just speak about 4 tips where this is concerned, and then give you an example of how this played out in a Nigerian company. Now, first storytelling tip is open with a bang. Your first slide or your first couple of slides have to keep your reader engaged, curious, and inquisitive. And this is usually where the storyboarding comes in. When you have a compelling storyboard and engaging storyboard, then you have the reader interested in finding out what's in that slide and then moving on to the next one, right? It's important that you keep the reader engaged and curious, because I mean there are so many reports to read. Why should I read your own? That's the perspective. Second thing would be beware of your knowledge. And I think it's something I've mentioned or I referenced a bit back sometime. The reason why we have glossary of terms in some reports is because the people who put that report together recognize that the readers may not necessarily have the knowledge that they have, right? So it would be good to set context for a number of things. Do not assume that the reader knows, set context. And now this depends on your reader. If your reader is an internal stakeholder, chances are they may know most of the things that you know. If your reader is an external stakeholder, then they will likely not know, and you need to document properly and concisely. Then keep the flow. I would say, and something we talked about is the whole top-down approach, meaning keep the core idea. Or I'll put this 2 ways in keep the flow. Let's take it one step at a time. Don't try to choke your reader with too much information on one slide at the same time. Each slide should generally have just one central idea, one core idea that is then explained in the rest of the content of that slide. Now, depending on how you're structuring your information design, you may split a slide into 2 and then have 2 ideas on the same slide, or maybe structure in such a way that they look like 2 pages as opposed to 1. But the whole idea, especially when creating your reports with PowerPoint, is keep your slides to one idea primarily. Keep the core idea behind the slide, and the core thing, the core concept you're trying to communicate as a storyboard at the head of the top of the slide, and then you keep the evidence towards the bottom. And that's sort of the pyramid principle. Starts with give context. This is what I'm trying to tell you, and here's my proof, right? So that you don't explain tired. Then finally, maps of meanings. Now, this is something that is actually perhaps one of the most important bits with storytelling, and that is that that the meaning we attribute to the data we're presenting is what is very key. So, for example, I said before that, hey, this year my company did 150 billion. This is just me speaking, like my company did. You get the point. Anyway, 150 billion, and you may not know how to feel about that without context. And because I am the writer, I am in the position to provide that context for you. So if, for example, last year, the company did 120 billion and this year we did 150 billion, I will be very happy to write 120 billion there in bold and give it the growth rate and make it big and, make you focus on that part, or give that meaning or that sense or meaning to that statistic or that data point that, hey, we did great. If, for example, last year we did 160 and this year we did 150, I probably would not, while I would still put like the decline rate there, I probably would not make it the biggest thing. I'll probably highlight something else that is good and great, that aligns with my with the core thing I want to pass across on that side. Except you want to tell your reader that, hey, there's something we need to be careful of because revenues are dipping. Or if you're still trying to paint a story of, oh, we're doing good, there are other metrics you can put out there. Perhaps you could look at, okay, what your percentage of the market share is looking like, or how you have outperformed the market. So if, for example, and I think this is something that Spotify does, tells you that, or the Spotify wrap-up that we have, tell you that you're in the top 10%, or in the top 50%, or in the top 40%. So the thing now is that in this report that I'm writing, my revenues may be dwindling, but the meaning I'm giving to that statistic of we did 150 billion, I'm the one assigning that meaning to it. I can tell you, oh, we were in the top 3% of the companies and the banks in the industry this year. Our revenues are dwindling, but that's not what I'm passing across. That's not the meaning I'm giving to that 150 billion. The meaning I'm giving to it is, hey, we're still doing great, we're top of the world. Except I want to tell you, oh, we need to watch something, we need to buckle our belts, our revenues are dwindling. basically what I'm trying to say is that with storytelling, what you need to pay attention to is that you are the one who assigns the meaning to the data that you're presenting. Now, here's something that happened, I think, a couple years back. I think sometime 2021, 2022, a fintech in Nigeria released their reports to investors as to, I think, how they're done for the last year. And one of the things that came out in that report was that they had booked a high rate of non-performing loans or bad loans. So basically, they gave loans to people, and those people were not performing, they were not paying, which means technically would mean that, hey, money is going down the drain. Typically, that would be seen as a sign of a flaw in the system or a weakness or weak risk management, and the management of the company could be called to question for having such high non-performing loans. But this particular organization, they flipped the script, right? And rather than saying, oh, we have bad loans and leaving it there, or we have a high rate of bad loans and leaving it there, they flipped the script to say, hey, we've used this experience to better our technology and learn to identify bad players early on. And I think in that particular report, they sort of showed how they did that. So they basically turned what would ordinarily have been a bad metric, a bad data point that would have caused investors to say, you know what, I'm pulling out of this company, to something that would keep the investors in the game. Like, hey, yes, this happened, but there's the good side to this, and this is what we're choosing to see, this is what we're choosing to, this is the meaning we're taking out of this metric, right? So data without insight is meaningless, and usually with insight is in us assigning meaning to that data point, right? And in assigning meaning is where we have the other two data types. We talk about nominal data, which is what it is. When we talk about ratios and we talk about comparative data, that's how we go ahead to gain insights and assign meaning to those nominal data points. And I think one of the things that this particular company reminded me of when this whole thing with the report happened was something that was said in one of the thousands from the chop our bobo if it's well garnished, right? It's bobo, but if you garnish it well, assign the right meaning, your investors or your readers will eat it hook, line, and sinker and would get the idea that you're trying to communicate to them clearly. All right, let's now move on to the final section. This section I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to run quickly through it. And this has to do with information design, the art of presentation, the art of putting these documents together in cohesive formats. Now, we're going to talk about this particular section in three subsections. We looked at design tips because it's called information design, we're designing information. Then we're going to take a look again at content is king, and this is important because I just need to highlight a few things where that content plays a hand in when we're doing information design. And then finally, we're going to look at tools of trade, and I'll highlight a couple of other platforms that I typically would use to make great information layouts and slides and decks and the like. Right, so design tips. What's the whole point? Proportions and hierarchy, grids and alignments, white space, typography, color theory, using images, adding spice. Now, I know that you may be thinking, hey, I'm not a designer. This is beginning to look like Photoshop stuff. Of course, as I'm sure you've summarized already, everything you can see on your screen has been done with PowerPoint. It's the same PowerPoint you're using. I didn't necessarily add something funny to my own. It's exactly the same one. Right? It's how you use it and design principles. Now, there's something I say that everybody understands. Design is a language everybody understands, but not a language everybody speaks. And that's because you can easily tell from looking at two different products which you think would be more expensive. You can easily tell from looking at two different adverts which you think would be a bougie party and which may be, someone in his backyard putting something together. Even though those nowadays are getting bougie, but you get my point. Right, but basically design is something that when we see, we all know a bad design, or I won't say we all know, we tend to know a bad design when we see one, right? And we also know how to appreciate good design. So it's something that I believe everyone at least already has a fundamental idea of and can be harnessed for better information design. So let's jump in. What's the whole point? Again, it's to communicate, it's to tell a coherent and engaging story for a target and purpose. The purpose of my end of the report say, well, we did great, or hey, we didn't do well, we need to buckle our belts on 1, 2, 3. Or the whole point of informational design is to communicate, tell a coherent story. And in telling a story or in communicating, contrast is key. Now, if someone walked into a room and kept shouting, like if someone just walked into a room and started shouting, of course, first things first, you'd be alarmed. You would look at the person, is everything okay? Do we need to move it to Yaba? But if the person just keeps shouting at that constant level, over time, you would drown the person's voice out because it maintained a constant level. So contrast is key. because it gives hierarchy. It tells you what is important and tells you what is most, especially when it comes to looking at a page or looking at a slide. It also helps to guide your reader as to what to read first, or what the person sees first and what the person sees next, right? And then having this contrast also helps to maintain engagement. If I design this particular page all in the same font, all in the same size, without any colors, it will not look as engaging as this. So the whole point is to communicate, tell a coherent story, and in telling that story, contrast is key. Just like in normal movies or in stories, you have the antagonist, you have the protagonist, and then you have the supporting cast. That contrast is key, right? So in creating contrast, everything else we're going to be talking about really has to do with creating that contrast, guiding your viewers through the document. First things first is proportional and hierarchy, as I'm sure you can already surmise. Is that the bigger something is, the more important it is, right? Yes, we know less is more, but sometimes bigger is better, right? So the bigger your text is, bigger an image is, the more importance you give into it, right? And now in proportions and hierarchy, or in sizing, rule of thumb is use multiples. Don't just change sizes randomly. Use multiples of 2, use multiples of 1.5, and if you're going to be very technical, use the golden ratio 1.168. But I mean, that's for actual designers. We can keep up multiples of 2 and 5. Now it's very easy to do this with fonts. You can simply maintain font sizes. So if you're using 12, if you're using 24 for your storyboard, you can use 12 for your body text, and you kind of need to maintain the consistency throughout the entire document. So font sizes, your shape styles, your icon sizes, it helps with pattern recognition, such that once I get to the next page, based on how I've read the previous pages, I already know where you're going, I know what's important, and I can easily or more easily digest that slide or that page. Then you have grids and alignments, and I would say this: grids are everything. I know, or rather, alignments are everything. For people who have had the opportunity, or maybe not the opportunity, people have been unfortunate to work with me on a document, you know that one of the things I pay super attention to is alignment, because as bland as this particular page is, the reason why it looks good, the reason why it looks clean, is because of alignment. And there are tools to help with that. There are line functions in PowerPoint, but it's something that I would say pay attention to. The human eye is primed for pattern recognition, and if there's something that's slightly off, there is some discomfort, some natural discomfort, a natural sense of anyhowness or scatteredness that typically comes, or that is that document or that thing is viewed as just things scattered here and there with no clear alignments, right? So in alignment, birds of the same feather flock together. You typically put things that are similar together, and then things and separate them. Let there be a clear separation between them and other things. And then unless you know what you're doing, always align. Like always, it's in red. Always align. And for alignments, grids help a lot. There's a way to set up grids on your PowerPoint that can help the eyeballing to be better, so that you can align much better and much quicker. And I think if there's time towards the end, I may just show what my PowerPoint window looks like, so you can see the grids I use and how I set that up. Right, so white space. You need your document to breathe, and it's one of the things that makes for a good document. You know, earlier on we talked about how you're not supposed to choke your reader. It's not supposed to be too full. There needs to be enough white space for the elements to sit in. One of the things I like to do is I like to maintain spacing on the edges of a document. There are a number of reasons for this, but one of two reasons that I would state quickly. One, it gives breathing space, and I typically would use grids to mark out those areas so I don't mistakenly put stuff there. And then two, it's helpful when you're printing a bulky document and they need to cut it. So for anybody who maybe has had experience in design and printing before, it do usually pain when you design something nice, you print it, and then by the time you're cutting it, the stuff on the edges goes away, and then your design just looks very funny, and you have your clients wondering whether you are a carpenter who's for this design. But anyway, edge corner space at least 0.5 inches on every side, top, sides, bottom, equal proportion and spacing between elements. And there are tools or functions within PowerPoint that allows you to do that. When in doubt, use white or off-white backgrounds. I've seen a couple of funny slides or funny documents that use colored backgrounds and they just look funny. So rule of thumb, use white backgrounds. If you have to use a colored background, my advice is go with a very deep shade background, a dark background, and have the text be white so that there is that clear contrast between your background and the text. Typography. Typography is another very important thing that is key because type fonts sort of have their personalities, as you can see. I mean, the typography, the big one block fonts looks very serious, and you have Meteor type that sort of looks playful, looks like a handwriting. It gives different vibes, right? Depending on what you're trying to communicate, the type of fonts you use matters. However, I would say typically use fonts within your brand guide. If you don't have a brand guide, stick to Arial, Calibri, and if you are being, if you're explorative, you want to experiment, then there are a couple of fonts I could just quickly recommend: Helvetica, Montserrat, Gotham. I think those three typically. Proxima Nova, I think that's the last final one. And we typically would tweak font size, color, and font type for contrast. But the thing with this is consistency is key. If I'm using two fonts, my rule of thumb really is don't use more than 2 to 3 fonts in the entire document. If you're using one font for your header, ensure that that font stays as your header throughout the document. Because those documents tend to look funny if in the beginning you see Arial, towards the middle you see Calibri, towards the end you see Times New Roman. It just looks like what's going on here. It's a lot of things. There is no consistency. Now with typography, when in doubt, align left. I've seen certain people that align center and align right. There are times when you do that, but unless you are certain and you know what you're doing, then align left. Typography is a field on its own that we would not get into. Let's keep moving. Using images. Images are usually worth 1,000 words, as the saying goes. Key things to keep in mind when you're using images: ascertain the quality, ensure that you source your images from quality places like FreePic, Pexels, Free Images, and co. We'll talk about that when we get to tools for a bit. Then use frames to give order and structure to your images. So sometimes it's better to have your images around a thick frame or a box, right? And not just or a circle. So it's possible to crop an image to shape. It's a crop circle, crop to a star, just to give that image some sort of order to structure, so that it's not just hanging there with nothing reference to it. And usually when you use images, alignment is key. So you align your text to the image, then you align top, so you align sides, depending on where you're putting your image. But the alignment is key. When in doubt, avoid stroke outlines, especially the thin ones around your image. It usually gives early 90s, 1999. So those documents back then that typically use those thin outlines. Now, color management. There are certain images that come full of color, and then you now have another image that's not so full of color. One of the ways to manage this, especially if you have 2 or more of such images on the same slide, is to use overlays. Overlays just help you manage the colors in your image. So how you can simply create an overlay is you create a rectangle, give it a color, place it over the image, and then reduce the transparency of that rectangle. So it allows the image to come through, but at the same time it gives you a color. At the same time, there are color correction with color tools in PowerPoint that allows you to change the colors of your images in alignment with the theme colors that you have in the document. All right, color theory. Since we've been talking about colors, now we're here still like dwelling on colors, and you can see how that flowed nicely, right? So keeping the flow, right? So color theory, avoid experimentation. This is not where you learn. Typically, I would say when you're writing documents, this is not where you learn how to use colors. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. There is a color wheel that you can use, and we'll talk about those tools in a bit. But there is a platform called colors.co. It gives you amazing color combinations that work. There's also Adobe color.adobe.com. They also give you amazing colors that work. So these guys are going through the trouble of looking through color theory, doing all the research, doing all the work. All you have to do is go there, pick a palette that works for you, and stick to it. There is no need for you to start picking all the colors yourself. Now with colors, less is more. Monochromatic color codes are usually great, especially for business documents. And for business documents, I would say keep the colors to blue, dark green, those are typically safe documents. But of course, if your company would have, or ideally should have, a brand guide that has its brand colors, and you could use just that. The reason why blue and green are typically safe colors is because they portray security, growth, and sustainability, which is what almost every company would want to portray. Adding spice, using shapes, using lines, using icons, background elements, getting creative. We'll talk about some of the tools that you could use to generate some of these things, but lines, shapes help you to put stuff into context, help to create that contrast that is necessary in storytelling. Right, content is king. I'm just going to run through this since we talked about content for a bit. Less is more. Typically, when you have more time with a document, the end result is that you would have a shorter document, a more concise document that is heavier, or more that is heavier. There's Leonardo da Vinci that says simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So it's not about how many things you write or the big English you're using, but less is more. Streamline, streamline, streamline. So understand the content, identify the essentials that you need to communicate what you're trying to say. So for example, if I'm trying to say my company did great, there are 1,001 metrics I can use to say that, or to portray or communicate that. What I have to do is identify the essential ones I need to put, the essential evidence I need, so that I don't need to explain tire, and I eliminate everything else, right? So it's basically, what do I need to say to meet the target, or what do I need to say to prove the point? One of the ways that helps you to identify content fluff in your documents is just go a paragraph analysis. What is this paragraph saying? What is the gist of this paragraph? Now, if you identify that gist of the paragraph and you find that the paragraph meandered, or that particular slide meandered and had things that does not add substantially to that gist, take out that fluff, right? So condense. Imagery over words. Images are much faster. We process images much faster than we process words, which is one of the reasons why images are worth 1,000 words. So as a rule of thumb, any data points you have over a period or anything you're trying to see, once you can turn it into an image, you can convert it into a chart or a scorecard or a graph. Do that. Don't keep the long story. Don't write, this year we created 215 projects in 20 local governments, and skip it. Just put 20, put subtext projects. Another number of communities. So skip the prose, just keep it to the core figures, condense, right? Captioning and storyboarding is everything. Remember, as we mentioned before, the storyboard basically contains a summary of everything else in the slide. Now, getting that storyboard right enables you to easily identify what is fluff and what is not in the rest of the slide. Okay, so visualizing content. So with time-based data or trends, you can use graphs. With discrete data points, like I just mentioned earlier, you could use scorecards, which is basically the number and then what that number stands for, what that number represents. And then you have volumetric data. You could use tree maps. Relationship between items, you could use charts. It could be hierarchical, it could be custom, you could layer charts, so that rather than having 5 different charts, you could layer the charts into one. And then for stages and processes, you could use a flow chart. So if, for example, you had a project and you've only got into stage 3, rather than writing, oh, we did this, we did that, and we got stage 3 of this project, you just have a flow. Those arrows, and say, hey, done, this is where we are. It's much more easier to digest that way. So finally, we're going to be talking about the tools of trade. Of course, as I said, this was built in Microsoft PowerPoint. There are other platforms out there like Pitch.io. Of course, there's Keynote for MacBook users. And then there are a couple others. I think there's Prezi. Prezi was a rave, I think, maybe say 5 years ago. Not so sure how many people use Prezi, but Prezi gives you like some really interesting tools as well. Now, for some of the content that you find, so things maybe you're sourcing images, you're sourcing icons, you're sourcing illustrations. Platforms I would recommend: Freepik for images and illustrations, Pexels for images. You also have Pixabay and a couple others. And there's StorySet. StorySet gives you amazing illustrations in sets. So you can take a set and use it in your entire document, and it keeps it. There's consistency because you're using exactly the same set of icons or set of illustrations, as opposed to using one illustration that is black and white, and then further down the line you're using a purple illustration, and then further down the line you're using a green illustration. StorySet basically gives you interesting illustrations in sets that you can then use and tweak. Flat Icons gives you, as the name implies, gives you icons. And there's a platform called Hikey. I would advise you to check this out. It helps you generate almost any SVG asset that you need. So from backgrounds to bubbles to amazing stuff. For lack of time, I'd have wanted to show like what that platform looks like, but check it out, hik.com. Then you have Colors and Adobe Color, which I referenced earlier. These guys basically give you color wheels with defined color palettes that you can pick and use without stressing yourself trying to figure out what color matches with what, and having color blocking and the rest. Now, with PowerPoint, I would typically say, at some level, do away with the usual PPT templates that come with PowerPoint. They look PowerPointy, and sort of they have the ability to restrict how creative you can get when it comes to information design. So I typically would start out my my documents with a blank canvas, create my own structure, and then move on. So use the design tab for consistency. The design tab is where you go ahead to set your color scheme, your fonts, and every other thing that is supposed to remain consistent throughout the document. The tab on PowerPoint called the design tab. So typically one of the first things I would say is when you open the document, set that first. Set your colors, set your fonts, set your sizes, and then start documenting. Then use rulers, grids, smart guides. It is important. Alignment is everything. Learn shortcuts. It helps your workflow as opposed to having to do everything manually. Then usually if you're using a font with, and I think I feel this with a particular person, if you're using a font that doesn't typically come with windows, you would need to embed the font in the document so that when another person opens it, it doesn't scatter. I'm not going to delve into that, but as I said before, Google is your friend. Then there is one thing I did add to my PowerPoint, and it's a tab that basically puts a number of tools that already exist in PowerPoint in one particular tab, so that I don't have to jump from design tab to edit to insert tab to home tab. It just puts everything in one place and called Power User. Do check it out. I think they offer a free version as well. Right, so I think at this point I've come to the end. Thank you for staying with me for the last 52 minutes. This session was proudly brought to you by Crypto. Do check out the website crypto.com. At this point, I would take questions. If there are, okay, have there been questions? Okay, I see one hand.
How exactly did you create? I mean, I know that you have explained how to go about it, but this your particular slide, like your presentation is giving everything it should give. So she's wondering, like, how exactly did you get the playful typography that you use, that font? Or what was the font name? How do we get it? Is there like yeah? So yeah.
Okay, so I didn't talk too much about fonts, but
yeah.
So I get fonts from primarily one place, ifonts.com. Sorry, ifonts.xyz. They have a lot of interesting fonts there that you could download and install on your system. The name of this particular font that I use is called InkPen. So I'm only using two fonts in this entire presentation. It's Helvetica Neue now. Helvetica Now, actually. Helvetica Now, and then InkPen. Those are two fonts I use. If you're looking to source fonts, ifonts.xyz, they have a ton of fonts with responsive choice.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I just put it on the group chat for everyone, so if you like to check that out. So we would also take one or more or two more questions at this point. I can see someone's hand up, so please give me a moment. I'm going to let you speak. So yes, Wando, you can go ahead. I believe you can go ahead to ask your question.
Yeah, hi Toro, good evening. Thank you, Abby. Good evening, everyone. Would it be possible for you to just do a quick little demonstration, 1 or 2 minutes? I know you mentioned alignment and how PowerPoint shows you the alignment tab depending on the version you are using. PowerPoint is the same, but not all PowerPoints are equal. Let me put it like that. Also, the design tab just shows a little bit there. So just a few of the things you mentioned, just show us a little demonstration so that we can have evidence that of a truth these things can be done. And they can be done by all of us that have the same one head.
Okay, all right. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. So this is my PowerPoint. And as someone, the first thing you notice is there are lines everywhere, right? And that's how to do that is grids, rulers, guides. Now all the lines are gone. So you come to the view tab, put up the ruler. The ruler just basically helps you measure stuff. Grid lines throws up the grid lines that come with. So they basically just divide the document into boxes. And then you then have guides. Now you can see with my guides that they're custom. I can move them. I can see that this guide aligns with where I have this box ending. Now one of the things that you then find throughout the rest of the documents is I don't have anything go beyond that line. Everything else sort of aligned to that line as you go and you go and you go. The other question was design tab. This is the design tab. And sorry, 1 second. Oh, okay, good. All right, so this is the design tab, and one of the first things I would typically do when I open a document is I would come here and I'll set my colors. So if you see, I have a couple of custom colors, and I have some for certain brands that I've done some documents with. What this helps you do is, if you work with colors like this, is that you can quite easily change the color scheme of your entire document without having to go through each one after the other, right? So if, for example, you did something for Google, you could pick, move, yeah, and you can customize your color schemes. Oops, I think I may have messed up my color scheme. Let me Control Z. All right, thank you very much. You could customize your color scheme and pick the precise colors that you want, and then you could save that as, let me say, crypto presentation. So anytime I want, so you could save this for your company or for a particular brand, and every time you're creating a document for them, you just pick that and you know you have their colors on lockdown. The other bit you have here is the fonts. And as you can see, I have a couple of custom sets as well, and usually once you change, it changes everything across the border. So as I mentioned, fonts I'm using Helvetica now, I think bold or black, and then regular. And this just basically helps me in such a way that whenever I'm inserting any, let me see, create a new slide. Whenever I'm inserting anything, this is the Power User tab that has everything right in one place. But whenever I'm inserting anything, like say text, by default, it comes with the text that I have put on the theme, and I can easily change it to theme fonts, that font, 2 fonts I selected. Now this is the ink pen, and it's here because it's a third font that I just kept using a lot in the document, so it appears there. Other question. I think we talked about alignments for a bit, and I'll talk about how I typically will go through that. So I don't know if this is a good one, but if you see, I have these things grouped, and what I would then do after grouping it is I would come to, let me not use Power User so that you wouldn't say that it's not in, you don't have that. Let's come to Home, Arrange, Align, Distribute. So what this will do is distribute the content horizontally. I wish I could use another example of a scattered document. I'll probably give you something much. Because for example, when I was putting this together, imagine you just draw all the circles and then you're trying to, it could be stressful to try to manually, try to put all these things and ensure that they're in the right spot. All I have to do is select all of them and come to my Align tab. And the reason why I'm doing this align is because it's very important. I align bottom, see that on bottom, and then I would then align mid, align center, and voila. Perfectly done. I don't need to stress myself about, like, is it perfect, is it not? Like, the PowerPoint does that for you and a ton of other stuff. Is there anything else that I may be missing? Okay, so I think for those who may have questions as to how this was created and how it appears on every page, I know initially I talked about doing away with PowerPoint's default templates and creating your own, and how you could typically create page elements that stick throughout or that remain throughout the entire document is from your Slide Master. So you come to your View tab, come to Slide Master, and in Slide Master you can basically design. That's where these things then become edited. You can then put in what is that you want there, and then this basically applies to every page that you create. Now this page, for example, doesn't have anything on it. All I have to do is right click, layout, and I think the one I did was title slide. That's it, and that appears, and I can then move on from there, and then keep designing. Were there any other key questions that this was concerned? Well, it's PowerPoint. It's all PowerPoint, and again, alignment is everything. You can see this line again, just guiding all the elements that I have, and then you see that when I have this set of items below the header, it's aligned. I maintain the same font size 80 across board, and then here I have 28, and it's maintained across board, and just creates that seamless, that cohesive feel as to the entire document. Yeah, so that's about it.